Okay, so we're back. It's currently Wednesday afternoon, getting this put together for the Thursday lecture, the Thursday video lecture, and just going to try to mumble through it because guess what? Buongiorno is still not feeling good after 3 days of antibiotics, and guess what, brothers and sisters? Buongiorno is starting to go a little bit bonkers over this. You know, Buongiorno's tough. He's tough and all, but, you know, it's after about 12 days of just feeling like crud. It's like it starts to wear a person down, especially in the midst of, like, having to, like, juggle 14 flaming sabers and 2 scimitars at the same time and catch them without, like, cutting my hands. But, I think we'll get through it. I think we're going to get through it. Need to stay positive in these very uncertain times, right? So, anyway, I just want to recap really quick some of the things we went over for some of you that did not deign to attend Tuesday on Collaborate. Syllabus did go out via email, all right? I will put it up on Blackboard. I know some of you, you know, Blackboard, you know, is you're umbilically linked to Blackboard, you know, it's like, however, you know, it's like, this is a multimodal course, you know, it takes on many different forms and shapes, not like the shapeshifters on the Avengers, or whoever, X-Men. It is mercurial, you know, it flows, it ebbs, it does what it does sometimes without me knowing it. Syllabus went out. Want to talk a little bit about quizzes. There's, if you check the syllabus, there's 3 quizzes that will be scheduled, one in October. You'll get more than enough time. And it's like I said, usually what I'll do is I'll do like a module of 3 chapters and then do a quiz. And any 90% of the questions will be already available to you to study and the answers. So it just becomes a question of me learning how to do quizzes on Blackboard, or we'll figure it out. And those are going to be, you know, just like 15% of the grade. But, you know, you should do well on them if you spend any amount of time. And media scans. You know, media scans, since we're going to be in a remote environment, I'm going to get that media scan schedule up. We'll talk about it in our next meetup next Tuesday. I'll go over it, who's going to go when, and give you adequate amount of time. And we'll probably just have a section, like a discussion thread, where you'll be able to upload your media scan, whether it be a video or PowerPoints or a paper or whatever you're going to do. And remember, okay, let's like not get all crazy about this, you know, to get, you know, all panic stricken. It's show and tell. You know, the video, it's like if you're going to do a video, I'm strongly suggesting to stay between like 5 and 7 minutes, no more than that, which can be kind of a challenge, you know, but you know, this isn't a major project, you know, but, you know, hopefully it will act in a way in which show and tell should work, you know, and in that it will allow us to see different things and hear about different issues that we might not necessarily know about that are, you know, that pertain to you, that you have a certain, you know, you're an aficionado of, or have a certain, you know, propensity to be into, whether it be an app. Remember, it can be an app, it can be some media issue going on, something that you're really into, you know. So there's going to be that. And we went over final papers and projects. That's way down the road. And the course blog. You know, I'm still getting emails from people in regards to getting onto the course blog, and I've offered, you know, it's like if you're still having problems getting onto the course blog, email me We'll go over it on the phone if we have to. Same thing with collaborate. It's like at least one or two people continue to have these. I think that Agent Smith from the Matrix is probably infiltrating your laptop. We'll fight him off. But if you're having problems getting onto the collaborate sessions, this is a time we got to fix. We're deep in the forest already, folks. So whatever kind of little technical bugs we're having, we got to be swatting those things like in the here and now. Within like the week. So that's the thing. So if you're still having problems with either commenting on the course blog or getting on to collaborate at the time that we're meeting, I give you guys ample time and heads up. We know now that Tuesdays collaborate and Thursdays a video is going to be like the thing, unless, except for like how it's like, we'll figure out like how we're going to do things around the holidays and the mid-semester break in order to properly deal with that. For this week, I'm probably not going to get into Chapter 3 today because there's so much going on still in Chapter 2 on media effects that I haven't really covered that I'm going to probably like hold off on Chapter 3 until we meet next week. I think it's going to take the entirety of the time to get through the rest of Chapter 2 today. But you should be up on Chapter 3. You should have at least read Chapter 3 this week sometime so that, you kind of know your way around that chapter. Once again, the chapters are longish. There's a lot of information there. There's a lot of little boxes and sidebars and little shiny ornamental things and all that. They usually take, I've been finding that getting through a chapter usually takes about 45 minutes to an hour, alright? Which is not coal mining. It's not working in a coal mine, folks. It's sitting down, for an hour and reading the chapter. Once again, those of you who have bought the book will know about the website, edge.sagepub.com/Hansen, Hanson, 7E. That's for edition 7. That's going to have all your videos, all your flashcards, all your quiz material. So you're going to have to know how to get to the above. Let's get back into what we were talking about. We kind of skimmed the surface, I know, and we kind of jumped around due to, certain outstanding issues that we were having, and we wanted to talk about things that were topical around pieces of the Hansen chapter, connecting the dots to things that are happening in the here and now when he relates to certain things. But this chapter is primarily about an area that is controversial in itself because it deals with this idea of theories that want to address the question of how it is and to what extent or not that media affects us, and that's a loaded amount of concepts and ideas concerning. It wants to get out of the content, and it wants to get to the receiver. It wants to concentrate on us, concentrate on the audience, concentrate on how we take stuff up, how we are affected by it to a lesser or greater degree. And this discourse started with a model of an effect model called the direct effect model. And it springs up, Hansen says fears that media messages would have strong direct effects on audience members grew out of propaganda efforts by all combatants during World War I, by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in the 30s. Critics worried that mass media messages would overwhelm people in the absence of the influences of family and community. Remember what we were saying, that there was this transition from the village and rural agricultural communities, and the shift during the Industrial Revolution and by the turn of the century into these great urban centers. and the concern, the overwhelming concern that people had was this idea of this erosion of family values and the role of the church and small, it's like the John Cougar Mellencamp song, right? Born in a small town. That celebration of, those kind of small town values and this fear that the big bad wolf of the city and mass media were obliterating those sources or those effects on shaping culture, and that's a loaded question in itself, and it also seems to fit one of Hansen's like media secrets about how things are cyclical, because every 10 to 15 years, I can remember like George, the first George Bush, his vice president, like making this big thing, and this was like by like the late 80s, early 90s, talking once again about this erosion of family values in lieu of secular market-based, sensationalistic sex and violence on TV. So, I mean, it cycles out, and it continues to be this perennial concern, between like conservative, traditional ideas and more progressive ideas, but at the same time, a lot of these people's concerns would ultimately, we would find, be well-founded due to the fact that, mass media does have a tendency to kind of, act in that kind of overarching way of like becoming like the big dog in the pound. And we need to talk about the way it kind of creates a kind of social and consumerist conformity, due to what we'll talk about with media consolidation and also the whole idea of it being driven by profit, But with this direct effects model, it was the direct effects model basically was of the idea that the message itself, that the message was almost like a bullet being fired from a gun, where there would always be this like direct correspondence between what the message wanted you to do and what you did. It was almost like this kind of Pavlovian dog theory about if I ring the bell, the subject will salivate, and that would be and that was a very, very simplistic model of what was happening, because already we see with like the sender, message, channel, receiver model, we already have feedback in so many different ways, and each of these models, whether it be the direct effects model or the indirect effects model or the cultural critical model, all have their pluses and minuses, and we have to take them for what they are, and we have to be able to interlock them. It's much more complex than any one single model will cover. So that, certain, and it will beg the question of, where does, for instance, Hansen in this chapter doesn't really get into, and I'm sure he'll get into it in advertising, the role of the subconscious, the role, and we do this in image theory. We talk about the ways that advertising by the 40s and 50s gets very sophisticated in the symbolism it uses and the ways in which media will affect us unconsciously, and it will get really and it will use psychology. It will use Freudian and Jungian psychology and psychoanalysis to kind of shape a message that will kind of hit us unconsciously, and we need to talk about those kind of effects too, the kind that we're all kind of prone, that no one is kind of immune to. But we also have to talk about media literacy in this like effects model too, and that, depending on one's media literacy, an advertisement or a political slogan or a poster will have a different effect on different people depending on, and that's kind of what the indirect effects model will say. But he goes on here, with traditional social forces in decline, it was inevitable. Critics had this fear. A lot of this was based on this fear of, like, we saw what was going on. We saw this mass mobilization of fascism in Nazi Germany and in Spain and in fascist Italy, and critics here were very, very concerned about. But having said that, the American government was doing the same kind of things, and in propaganda, doing propaganda, not fascist propaganda, but propaganda to mobilize us into World War I, to mobilize us into World War II, and to get what is called in media studies a kind of consent, a manufacturing consent for a national policy. And this wasn't always for bad things either. A lot of, like, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would use the media to sell the American populace on reform and progressive ideas that they might not necessarily have had an understanding for. All right, so this whole direct effects model is almost like a bullet. Think of it like, like the bullet finding its target every given time, irregardless of, like, what the constitution of the target is, and it was simplistic. I use this little frame grab of Captain America, one of the old 40s Captain America comics. Logan Barnett, this is for you. This whole, like, anti-Nazi story, these anti-Nazis. It seemed like Cap was always fighting the Nazis during the 40s because that's who our enemy was at the time. And so we'll talk about the direct effects model, the indirect effects model, and the limited effects model. And I'll open up talk about the limited effects model. And this had to do, and a lot of the limited effects model was based on, primarily it used as its data information from voter campaigns, all right, which is kind of topical considering the fact that we're, like, neck deep right now as I'm speaking in this whole, last night was the first bullshit session, debate between our august presidential candidates, speaking, great truths to us, the minions of this country. Study voter. It was primarily done with voter studies. Wanted to know how voters had made decisions about who they were going to vote for in campaigns. During the 20s and 30s, the decades when the Nazis, Soviets, fascists were using propaganda, many critics worried that the media might be responsible for powerful direct effects on the public. Their general worries about the media extended to the possible effects of political campaign messages. They were concerned that messages would be so overwhelming that that the people would be like puppets. This idea that the democratic weighing of ideas would be obliterated by the overwhelming nature of, like, political campaign messages. So critics were worried, that they would overwhelmingly affect elections in negative ways, and that fear has continued to be well founded, knowing now what we know about the ways in which, for instance, with the coming, and a lot of these studies, it needs to be pointed out, it's like a lot of his case studies that Hansen pulls out are from the 40s and 50s, all right? Well before social media, well before the internet, well before all these far more sophisticated techniques of coercion and manipulation and, ways. It's like everything has gotten a lot more complicated than these studies would allow for, because these things, these other forms of media just didn't exist yet. Critics considered recent urbanization and the decline of traditional institutions. They feared that political media campaigns would inject people with ideas, like inoculate them almost like a vaccine or like a disease, and would lead to would lead to the creators' desired actions, like you'll do what we tell you to do. Which was somewhat simplistic of an assumption in the first place. We know it's much more complicated than that. The model of powerful direct campaign effects was largely discredited by voter studies in the 40s and 50s, and here's how they did it. One of the first, the People's Choice Study, it's called, the People's Choice Study. One of the first large-scale social scientific studies of campaign influences was the People's Choice Study in the U.S. of 1940. The presidential election was between Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, and a guy by the name of Wendell Willkie, who was the Republican candidate. A team of researchers led by a now famous media researcher that we've already talked about by the name of Paul Lazarsfeld, looked at how they took one county, all right? So they took Erie County, Ohio, all right? So think about the limitations of this study as I talk about the results, okay? One county in one area of the country, and they wanted to look how voters decided they wanted to look at how voters decided what candidate to choose to vote for. And his team found that people who were highly interested in the campaign, people that were very politically minded, and paid the most attention to media coverage, were least likely to be influenced by campaigns. And why, you may ask? Because they had already decided in advance. They were so already engaged in it that they had decided far in advance who they supported before the campaign had even begun. This is kind of a no-brainer that demographic would be okay. So what's it trying to say? That campaigns, it's like if I was like this staunch Trump supporter before the election even started, the study is telling me that whatever the other guy was saying was going to have very little influence on me. All right, so this one is just kind of a no-brainer. In contrast, voters who decided at the last, and then there's always what we call swing voters, people I don't know that aren't that concerned with politics, and those are usually those swing voters, who. They look at statistics and see how they voted in the past, and sometimes they voted either way, or whatever the parties were at a given time. It wasn't always Democratic and Republican, right? In early U.S. history, there were other parties, and there still are other parties. Voters who decided, swing voters, usually turn to friends or neighbors rather than the media for information about the campaign. In general, they turn to people who followed the campaign closely. All right, so the people that didn't know that, so basically all this study is trying to say, really, is that people that really weren't that involved with politics and wanted to go and do their civic duty and show up at the ballot box and throw that switch, went to their friends, like, who should I vote for? We'll find out that Lazarsfeld will term these people, these go-to people, opinion leaders, all right? I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that, that model, this study that's done in 1940, all right? So this concept of opinion leaders, all right, happens at a time when there's far less media, far less of a media barrage going on, and I would contend that, for instance, with the ascendance of talk radio and the ascendance of things like Fox News and other news services, that what were originally considered opinion leaders, guys like I would contend, and I think that this is a viable idea, that opinion leaders from those bygone days, your friend that you would go to, became substituted with people like Hannity or Rush Limbaugh, that due to the mass media, opinion leaders would become people that you didn't necessarily know. That you didn't necessarily know, that you were a fan of Rush Limbaugh, you liked him, he was funny, and you would just kind of adopt his whole thing. We have to understand this idea as we get into this of adoption, all right? How adoption meaning, not to adopt a kid, but how people will adopt certain overarching ideas and beliefs and values about everything from mass media in many ways. We'll talk about that. He also talks here about the messages and propaganda and the divergent ways in which propaganda has been used over the years. Here we have in the one photo we have a poster from the 40s trying to get people to get into ride sharing or carpooling, as we now call it. It was supposedly a good thing to do. And it's like when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. They use like this idea of like it was un-American to like not carpool, as opposed to a more recent poster that was put up in the I don't know what metro it was. It was the Los Angeles metro system. Wanted to try to get more riders on, so they used like a superhero, for people to kind of resonate with. In that campaign, it's like a campaign is usually the effectiveness of whatever the campaign is, whether it be an advertising campaign for a certain kind of social behavior or for voting for a certain person. It's always like, its success has always got to be measured by what? Whether it changes behaviors and how you can quantify that. And according to Hansen, the Los Angeles MTA campaign was very successful, increasing the number of discretionary riders from 24 to 36%. And then he resurrects his secret number 5. Opinion leaders are influential community members, friends, family members, and co-workers who spend significant time with the media. So Lazarsfeld suggested that information flows from the media to opinion leaders, and then from opinion leaders to the rest of the public. Keep in mind that the opinion leaders are ordinary people who are simply very interested and involved in a topic, all right? And I would say that this model, with the shift in media by like the 80s and the 90s to like, for instance, everything from like talk show hosts, like, or guys like Bill Maher on Politically Incorrect, or Jon Stewart, or Colbert would act in, I would contend in contention with Hansen that these opinion leaders can actually occur within the media. All right, I think I'm right with this. All right, that we start to, once we personalize and once we get into this whole era of of the cult of personality, with who's delivering the opinions of the media, the opinion leaders can actually exist within the media. People's Choice study, as well as other early voter studies, found that campaigns typically reinforce the existing political predispositions and that few people change their minds about who they were going to support. There are several reasons for this, he says. The voters who started off with strong opinions are unlikely to change them. We know that, right? The voters who pay the most attention to campaigns are those with the strongest political views. Thus, they are least likely to change their opinions. And the most persuadable voters, those who are least informed, or those who are, the least politically literate, one would say, are not likely to pay attention to political communications and therefore are not strongly influenced by media coverage and campaigns. All right. These are what the studies showed, but I think that we can all find numerous anecdotal examples with campaign ads that were highly effective and probably worked on swing voters due to their level of sophistication beyond the 40s and the 50s, right? So I think this is all partially true, but I think that the game has changed a lot from when these studies were first done. And I wrote here that, and this is what I truly believe, the problem with the effects model is that it fails to look at the content. We have to look at how effective, how overwhelming, how powerful the content is. We can't just divorce the receiver from the nature of the content and the nature of the message. Some messages it's like, whether it be advertising, it becomes a question of, like, for instance, advertisers more often than not, have a base that they play to that is going to buy their product, irregardless, they're already buying their product, so that their advertising campaigns, more often than not, are what? It's like to spend millions of dollars on an advertising campaign to get people who are already buying your product to buy your product doesn't really make a lot of sense. You're trying to hit those demographics of people, for instance, that, if you're Coke, you want to get those Pepsi people, or you want to get those people that don't drink soft drinks at all. That's not to say that advertising also has that function of, like, branding and keeping people connected to their product. But ultimately, it's always about capitalism as such and advertising as such. It's always about expansion. So your advertising agency, if it's not working on ways and means of, like, getting those people that aren't using your product, then they're really not doing their job. So we got to look at content as well as effects. They go hand in hand. For example, if political, it's like, let's take, like, what politics has become in the United States as opposed to the ways in which, I don't want to go too far with this, but the whole idea of the ways in which the Founding Fathers had kind of looked at that whole process of being one in which the democratic process would involve people that were informed enough about ideas and literate enough and politically aware enough where it would be more about social, political, economic, defense, foreign policy issues, the issues themselves, the intellectual, what that candidate had to offer intellectually and politically and emotionally to the people, as opposed to how it's become limited to these limited sets of, very, very basic, simplistic ideas about, what the economy is doing, or, so one would argue in a politics that was based on facts, in a politics that was really based on parsing and weighing the pros, the risk and benefits of certain programs, of certain ideas, of certain content, you would think within that kind of arena, divorced from all of the hyperbola, divorced from all the side issues, divorced from all the mudslinging, that a person in that particular milieu would be more likely to maybe switch, that they would weigh and deliberate. What I'm trying to say is that in that kind of ideas base, and this has to do with what should be as opposed to what is, in that ideas based discourse, a person might stay undecided and weigh the risk and benefits of both, and they would both sound kind of viable, and he or she would ultimately say, well, it's like this makes a little more sense, and there would be this thinking about it, as opposed to just going at things at this gut level. How is it that a person becomes like this staunch Republican? What are the mechanisms of that? What are the developmental mechanisms of that? How does one become a Democrat? Where does it start? Does it start with, the nuclear family? Do you vote the way that your family votes? Or do you vote the way of your education? There's so many other different factors involved in this, that need to be taken into account when we come up with models. Nothing is ever simple, And so what I'm trying to say here is that if political candidates built campaigns built more on policies and solutions as opposed to playing on subconscious emotions, people would be more likely to weigh and decide for themselves. All right? They wouldn't have to go to opinion leaders. All right? They wouldn't be already committed to a candidate before the election. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. To be like, it's kind of like this kind of knee reflex. Like, I don't care. I'm going to vote for him no matter what. And I think a lot of people have done that in the past. They were just like, I don't care about all this. I'm going with this guy. And you ask them why, and you interrogate them, and you try to get to the deeper levels of it, and they don't know. They just don't know. Well, he's good for the economy. But he did this, that, and the other thing to the economy. Well, that's not what I heard, So much of this is just based on emotion, misinformation, coercion, and these almost, subconscious emotional reflexes that it's hard to, it's become a swamp, and it's become a circus, folks. I think we all can admit to that. All right. What will come later will be this whole area of effects research that will do just that. It will make that contention. It will say, listen, this is far more complicated than you people are thinking about it. And you need to be far more critical of your theories. Hence, this whole school of thought springs up, and it springs up out of these really, really dire necessities. It will spring up primarily in France and Germany right around the time of the war, right around the late 30s and early 40s, when Hitler and Mussolini and, we're already seeing Russia go Stalinist. This group of Germans called the Frankfurt School, because they will come out of Frankfurt University in Germany primarily. But there will be journalists involved too. And there's women involved too, okay? It will include names like Theodore Adorno and Max Horkheimer and Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt and Siegfried Krakauer, and a bunch of like real smart people that are not only they're primarily sociologists and philosophers, and they wanted to understand the question that was the most important question that was looming for them was this, and it had to do with the fact that as they're theorizing about stuff, they're seeing their country turn into a meat grinder. All right, at least for Jews and other people. Okay, they're seeing this mass slaughter. All right, and the primary question that the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory had to pose was this. All right, we are the most advanced civilization technologically, in terms of culture, supposedly, that has ever existed on the face of the earth. Medically, we are the most advanced culture on the face of the earth, predicated on all these like high-minded principles. We fancy ourselves as being such. How was it that the most advanced society on earth unleashed the most bloodthirsty mechanism of destruction, the most bloodthirsty war, the most cadavers, the most military homicides that the world had ever seen? What had gone wrong with this and they would question this whole tradition of what was called the Enlightenment tradition that starts in like the early 18th century with guys like Voltaire and Rousseau and guys like Francis Bacon, and this whole move towards rationality and an ordered society and the ascendancy of science as being the litmus test for everything, and this supposedly rational culture. It's like they had to, and rightly so, they had to pose this question concerning how was it that we went so wrong? And they would do it in a lot of different ways. They would primarily kind of look at some of the assumptions of the Enlightenment and realize that, and they would start to see this connection between the supposed objective nature of knowledge, of scientific knowledge, all right, or rationality, or logic, and they would start to pick it apart and look at some of the underlying unconscious assumptions of power in all of these disciplines, and what they would see, and what they would critique, and what would be so earth-shattering in their findings would be that so many of these ideas that we had were really driven by these unconscious needs to dominate or extract things. The technology was about that. There was this kind of parallelism between science and technology and these ideas of like taming the world or conquering the world, or extracting the world's resources in order to become more powerful, and they would also look. So they were very, very big on Marx. They would study. They studied Marx, but they also studied the findings of Sigmund Freud. So they were kind of looking at psychology in conjunction with economic theory. And I know a lot of this is boring the shit out of some of you, but for a lot of you, it will be very, very interesting. I remember, first being exposed to some of these writers by other friends of mine, like older intellectual friends of mine, who were like, listen, you've got to, I was at a point in my 20s, in my intellectual development, where they were like, listen, you got to read Adorno. Like, I had a friend of mine who was a philosophy major at Binghamton University, and he was a couple years older than me. He was like, you've got to read Adorno to kind of understand this thing. How this thing all kind of happens, and they were and they were looking at this from a whole different set of lenses. Why was it that people would fall for these kind of things? Why was it that an entire nation, decided to throw their hats in with a guy that was basically preaching genocide? They wanted to understand these things. Hansen will kind of simplify it a little bit, all right? He'll talk about some of the main assumptions that the Frankfurt School was, and he in no way diverges from anything that I just said about this, but some of the main tenets of their theories, of critical theory, were that there are serious problems. There are serious problems. There still are. There's serious problems with me today. Trying to get this off the air. There are serious problems that people suffer that come from exploitation, all right, and the division of labor, all right. These ideas will come straight from Marx, Marx, and we'll have to talk about Marx at some point. His if you didn't get any Marx in high school, which you probably didn't, we have to talk about some of these ideas of like. What is exploitation, all right, and what is the division of labor? What is specialization? The second bullet: people are treated as quote things to be used, rather than individuals who have value. With this whole rational / capitalist / social engineering system. People become like quanta of data. And we see that now. Things to be used rather than individuals. People become commodified. Your labor turns into something that can be bought and sold on the market. Your identity. Talk about the Frankfurt School would never see like some of the most heinous things. They would be rolling over in their grave if they saw some of these things like identity theft, and social and social net and social media and the ways that we use it. You can't make sense out of ideas and events if you take them out of their historical context. This is an idea, all right, that is called, there's an egghead term for it, it's called hermeneutics, and it's about interpreting things in terms of where it came historically, as opposed to just trying to kind of look at something for what it was. For what it was. It wasn't just this analysis of the structure of for instance, eugenics or genocide or anti-Semitism. It wanted to see historically how this thing might have developed, in terms of culture, in terms of who was in power, in terms of different forms of representation, economics. It's like we can't understand anything, and if we just kind of pull it out of where it is in history. It's kind of like art. Art is that same way. It's like a lot of people look at, for instance, the abstract expressionist paintings and the cubist paintings, and the impressionist paintings from the turn of the century, then the 30s and 40s and 50s, and they're like, WTF, bro? It's like, what is this stuff? These squares, these boxes, these colors. It's like, I can do that. It's like, in order to understand the profundity of what some of these abstract expressionists and other kinds of far-out painters were doing, we have to understand not just what the painting is, but what it was responding to. What tradition it was attempting to push back against in terms of representation. All right? So to understand art, a lot of times, to understand music, to understand a certain political system, to understand slavery as an institution, we have to understand it in terms of where it comes in history, what drove it, how people were different, how their limitations, what came before, and what it would lead to. So this whole idea of putting things back into history to truly understand it. It's like when I first started the lecture today, I was talking about how these Paul Lazarsfeld studies were done in the 40s, and their results were done in the 40s and 50s, and how everything has kind of changed. So I'm kind of doing that here. I'm using critical theory to say that when the results of some of these like people's choice studies were done, we didn't have this, we didn't have that, we didn't have the other thing. And we have to see them within a certain historical context. The next bullet point, society is coming to be dominated by a culture industry. All right? This guy Theodore Adorno came up with a book, and he wrote this essay on the culture industry. And basically, what he was attempting to say is that culture as such, that area of our lives, the arts, folk art, certain rituals that we have, whether they be like small town rituals or all these cultural productions that had not been mass produced, but this whole homespun culture had morphed into one in which everything was mass produced. The culture became mass produced. We talk a lot about this in image theory. How everybody goes and buys the same like CD, or everybody goes and buys the same game, and that culture itself has become an industry as opposed to it springing out of a more organic, autonomous area of freedom, of cultural freedom. That it's becoming more of culture is not something that we do to provide us with a kind of the social. Culture was always something that, for instance, held the social fabric of a community together. We don't do that anymore, is what Adorno was saying. We buy it. It's just like buying toothpaste. We buy and in that way, it demeans it and it devalues it. That once we start treating our culture like buying a brand of cereal or a pair of sneakers, that it's no longer serving that function of holding the society together that it had previously done. It's just something we consume. We consume culture. We don't experience culture, and that would be his thing. He'll say society is coming to be dominated by a culture industry, what we might call the mass media, because he is there kind of at the birth of cinema. All these guys in the Frankfurt School, they will be there at that perfect storm, this kind of culmination, this rise of the movies and Hollywood culture. They will be in the thick of it, the rise of the radio, all right, and radio culture, and so society is coming to be dominated by a culture industry that takes cultural ideas, turns them into commodities, takes ideas and turns them into commodities, and sells them rather in a way to make the maximum amount of money. It's about profit now. It's not about whether it's good for you. It's about whether you're going to buy it. What it's going to excite in you. Or what preconceived notions you have about culture that you're just going to kind of buy it. This separates ideas from the people who produce them. All right, this whole idea of alienation, that the producers of intellectual culture, and this is a long story, and the whole idea of like the sellout, the guy that or the band that is doing a certain kind of thing and doing things their own way, and making this amount of money. And then some record producer or some record company coming to them and saying, well, if you just did a little of this and did a little of that and just toned it down a little bit, you'd probably sell 1 million more records. And them all kind of going, okay, the whole idea of the sellout, right? You can't separate, last one, you can't separate facts from the values attached to them and the circumstances from which these facts emerge, all right? What are they saying, all right? What they're saying here is that the facts are relative, you know? People talk about facts as being of this, like, you know, essential, you know, unwavering character. And what critical theory will say is that a fact is only as good as what's around it. You know, a fact can only be a fact, whether it be some scientific fact, you know, that claims to be objective. It's only as good. Think about like the whole climate change debate, you know, and how so much like misinformation is being purveyed as fact. You know, what is a fact? You know, sometimes it seems as if a fact is merely something that we believe because we've been told it so many times, as opposed to it actually having some connection with reality. All right? So facts don't mean anything. So we have these two different models of trying to interpretate media effects. You know, the effects model, this whole like what effect does it have? How, you know, looking at like the receiving end of the audience, or looking at things as being culturally constructed. You know, that it's culture that constructs the effect and not the thing itself. You know, one thing, it's like a certain message in one culture, you know, for instance, let's say like a commercial in 2020 America, you know, as opposed to that same commercial in, you know, Bangladesh or Syria might be highly offensive, you know. So it becomes a question of what is the context in which what is the cultural, historical, psychological nature of your receiving audience that dictates the nature of the thing. Quantitative versus qualitative. We'll talk more about this. You know, there's quantitative data that has to do, for instance, with take the Nielsen ratings. It usually has to do with, you know, the share, the share, the population, the amount of people that are watching something, as opposed to what their makeup is. You know, qualitative analysis is more about the quality of that thing. You know, and these are and that's what culture theory is more. It's about qualitative analysis, about running things through about trying to construct meaning outside of just data, just pure data. You know, because we got to remember, data. It's like, especially in the age of big data that we're in now, it's like everybody is like hanging all their hopes and dreams on what big data is going to do for us. But big data, but then again, you know, the guys and women that are really in the know about this kind of stuff are all of the opinion that you can have all the data you want. You know, how do we use it? How do we interpret it? How do we apply it? You know, it's like, you know, it's all this bits and bytes, but we got all this raw data. Now, what do we do with it? Data doesn't mean anything unless you're using it in some way or interpreting it in some positive way. How messages affect people versus how people use and construct messages. How we take them up, you know, as opposed to, you know, what it's like. So this is all kind of based on the idea that, for instance, as a filmmaker, I might have a certain intention, all right, that I want to get this idea across. And it might be a complicated idea. And it is in the film that I'm doing right now. You know, and I might have and it's like, and this is the challenge that every artist or every media producer that wants to like kind of push the boundaries and do something a little out of the norm faces. It becomes a question of this idea that I have in my head. Are people gonna get it? Are people going to actually be able to take it up, or is it just this thing I've got? You know, this pet idea I got, and no one's really gonna get it. You know, and that's why a lot of films get like test screened You know, especially if like the studios aren't sure about it. You know, they're not like, you know, it's like some films test really well. It's like, so a lot of like their economic decisions about whether they're going to put a film out or not, or how many places that's going to go, or how many units they're going to make, has a lot to do on these test runs, you know. And test runs have a lot of problems to them. They have a lot of ethical problems to them. They have a lot of just like common sense problems to them. Because what we found, and if you do any kind of like research about Hollywood and Hollywood history, a lot of times films that didn't necessarily test well with a test audience, and they just decided, well, it sucked in the test. People hated it. But they were just so financially committed to the film that they're like, we gotta like let it out anyway, right? Sometimes those films would become these huge hits because it was just, you know, the test. It's like the test itself. It's like maybe everybody was just. It's like the test is not always like, you know, running tests or running rough cuts is not always an indicator of what the success of a film will be. You know, and you always have, you know, within that whole like decision making process, you have, you know, studio executives that, you know, don't want to take any chances, and they might it's like, you know, one guy might crush a project just because he hates it and he's at the top of the food chain that would have been great, you know. Sometimes it's as biased as that. We talked about systemic reporting. We talked about all that. Now we want to talk about the different dimensions of message effects. What does... And he breaks them down into different areas. He talks about cognitive effects, and we've kind of been up this road before. The most common and observable message effect is on the short-term learning of information. What do we learn from a message? What do we learn from a TV spot? What do we learn from a documentary series? You know, what do we learn from a magazine article? This can be significant. It's just a question of like, what's the takeaway cognitively? What are the facts? You know, just the, like, I like to say just the fact. This can be as significant as learning about a new medical treatment or as trivial as remembering the lyrics to a popular song. The amount of learning that takes place from media content depends largely on the motivation level of the person consuming the media, it says. And he goes on to say political scientist Doris Graber found that people who want to be able to talk intelligently, if that's a value for you, right? Because for some people, obviously, and I'm sure you know some, talking intelligently about stuff is not a goal, all right? But if that is a goal for you, to talk intelligently with others about media content, whether it be news, a sporting event, or entertainment, those people learn much more from media than those people who are simply seeking entertainment. All right? They're not looking at their media for cultural or social capital that they can use at a college party or some gathering later on to discuss something with somebody. You know? That's not a value for them. It's more like, I just want to be entertained. I don't want to have to like pick it apart, and that's my goal. You know. So there's that. You know. Then we get to attitudinal effects. What's the difference? Attitudinal effects have to do with people's feelings about a product, how they feel about it, how they feel about an individual or an idea on the basis of media content. Viewers might decide that they like a new product or a political candidate, or a hairstyle because of what they have seen in a television commercial. You know, it's like, as sophisticated as we think we are very much a bunch of parrots, all right? We adopt, once again, this whole idea of adoption. We see something that we think is cool, you know, and if there's enough of a consensus that it's like, there's this whole like kind of formula for like, my friend who I think is very cool thinks this thing is very cool, therefore I will adopt that thing, because of this whole pairing I have with, it's like, it must be cool because my cool friend is using it. However, there might be a direct relationship. It might just be like, you might be one of these like, trendsetters that sees something and says, I'm going to do that, It's like, I don't see anybody doing that, So this idea of adopting different attitudes, a news broadcast, sitcom. Typically, it's much easier to get people to form a new opinion than to get them to change existing ones, all right? That might be true. That could be true, but I think that it's contendable. For example, political advertising generally tries to change the opinions of uncommitted voters rather than those of voters who already have strong political loyalties. Remember when I was talking about advertising? You want to get the people that aren't buying your product or haven't even thought about buying your product yet to get to buy your product. And he uses as an example the Bernie Sanders campaign, and we'll have to talk more about this, but he'll say about Sanders that, for example, political advertising generally tries to, blah, blah, blah. In the 2016 presidential election campaign, the Bernie Sanders campaign found substantial success by targeting younger, uncommitted voters who value being asked directly for their support. All right? Targeted, young, uncommitted voters who value being asked directly for their support. All right? That was one of the goals of his campaign message, to target young, uncommitted voters, right? Okay, I'll buy that. But once again, I think we have to go back to critical theory to start to understand. You can't just target like young. It's like if you had a demographic, say in like the 50s, of like 18 to 24-year-olds who didn't care about politics one way or another, whose lives were going very well and weren't really bothered by it, were less interested in it. It's like you might not have targeted younger voters. It has to do with the historical context and what that makeup is. Because Sanders will come, and we need to use like critical theory here. Sanders will come at a period where the youth demographic in this culture in 2016 is feeling very, very lost and very, very let down and very alienated and very disillusioned by everything that they've seen from the boomers and their Gen X parents and everything and their prospects, and they're just saying like, this sucks. We have to understand like the shared emotional gestalt, this like shared feeling of a whole subsector of the population, to understand why he would take. He doesn't just target them. Sanders doesn't just target the youth vote because it's like this like unknown quantity. He targets them because he's done the data and he knows that they're like discontent and he knows that they're ready for a change. So that this whole idea of using, they've kind of had it with everything, so that when he springs this term on them, socialism, which has now become a dirty word now, a bunch of that youth demographic are like, hey, why not? Because the fact of the matter is, and this is like one of the sad facts about it, was the fact that most of the teenagers, not the teenagers, but like the early, like that 18 to 24-year-old crowd, when they said, when they were polled and asked like, are you for socialism? It's like, they would, this huge percentage would say yes, and then when they were asked to explain what socialism was, the percentage got smaller and smaller because a lot of like young people just didn't know really what it really entailed. They just knew it was something new, and it had to be. If it's new and it's something that my parents hate, then it's got to be good. It's got to be good, you know. So that's the whole thought process behind that. Having said that, did a lot of young people know, you know, at least a little bit about what socialism entailed? Well, probably. Then we got behavioral effects. Behavioral effects include actions. It's got to be a behavior. It's something that we do as opposed to something that we think. You know, such as clipping a coupon from a newspaper, buying a product, making a phone call, or voting for a candidate. All right? The behavioral effects. How it changes our behavior. This might also include imitating attractive behaviors, or the behaviors that we deem attractive. For example, dressing a certain way. You know, I know back when I'm ancient, but when I was in high school, man, it was like there was this whole new subculture that sprung up around all these like new, like Madonna first hit. And like, you know, this whole group of girls wanted to just like kind of be Madonna. And then there was like Pat Benatar too, and like people wanted to look like Pat. People wanted to look punk. It was like there was a lot of cool stuff going on. There was a lot of like silliness and foolishness, but you could tell like how music was influencing people's fashion, you know, and what was cool and what was not. And it was a very watershed time for that because there was a lot of different things going on. There was a lot of different things going on in the schools. You could be this kind of dude or this kind of. There just seemed to be more of a variety and less conformity at that point because there were so many different bands and performers coming out that were all kind of different from each other. That everybody was kind of, you know, you had your hip hop guys, you had your like suit and tie like techno pop guys with like these like, you know, feather. It's craziness, but it was cool. Sometimes, however, people go to the media deliberately looking for behavior to copy, right? When a kid goes to see Batman or Black Panther or Thor, you know, they all come out, and I know this from experience, my friends, they all come out of there doing whatever that guy was doing. Whether it was Spider-Man, they'll be trying to climb the wall. If it's Black Panther, they'll try to hop on the car and then jump back off of it. If it's Thor, if they just saw Thor, they will grab something in the car and start whacking their brother with it, pretending it's Thor's hammer. This is called behavior adoption, and they all do it. All right. Psychological effects. Media content can inspire fear, joy, revulsion, happiness, amusement, among other feelings. A major psychological effect of media content, especially violent or erotic material, is arousal. We like to be aroused by stuff. You know, we like to be stimulated by stuff, whether it be violent, sexual, or just new and exciting with a lot of like, you know, special effects. You know, it's like we like to be like wowed by stuff. You know, symptoms of arousal can include a rise in heart rate, adrenaline levels, sexual response. Seeking a psychological response is a common reason for spending time with the media, right? Whether the response is relaxation, excitement, or emotional release. Arousal can come from content, action, violence, sexuality, loud music or sound, or from style. Motion, use of color, the rate and speed at which new images appear. Notice that music videos, which often offer little in terms of learning, or so Hansen says, sometimes a music video can be educational, provide many of these elements. You know, so what is it that we're looking for? And I'll kind of end with this. It's like, what are we looking for? You know, in a culture where most of our working day is this alternation between different grinds, right? Between work, you know, and often the drudgery of work, you know, and having to be at work and do this thing and waiting for like the end of your shift, like, oh, thank God. Or, school, these different forms of discipline that we find, not with my classes. I mean, my classes, everybody, like, runs in, and would pay extra. But other people, after the drudgery of the day, what do we look for? We look for something that is a little bit far and away from the same old, same old. We want to be, we want to be thrilled, or we want to be relaxed. We just want to listen to some, especially when you get older. Your musical taste might change. You might not be listening to headbanger like hair metal. You might be listening to acoustic jazz once you hit 60. That didn't happen to me. I'm still like a rock and roll boy to the end, to the very end, my friends. But the whole idea of like why we seek out things has to do with being stimulated, wanting a change, wanting something that kind of elevates us out of the drudgery of same old, same old. So we go to blockbuster films, or we go to big rock shows, or we go to clubs. There's a lot of laser lights and all this stuff. We want an effect. We're searching something out to fill in the blanks. And sometimes these things provide us with that. And then it begs the question of it always begs the question of like why how are we using culture? And can't we be entertained and educated and elevated at the same time? Can't things serve these different functions? And many things do. There's no like fine lines between it's like one person's like yawn fest of a documentary, like a Ken Burns thing on baseball or something like that. One guy might pass out within 10 minutes. Another guy, that's his entertainment. It's informative, it's inspiring, whatever, but that's his entertainment. For another guy, he needs more lighthearted fare with like The Hangover, with like jokes about flatulence. It's like, whatever, but we have to ultimately ask ourselves, it's like, what does our diet consist of, So that's it for now. This is Bonjourno signing off. Just kind of going through the motions tonight, but remember, we're going to meet on Collaborate on Tuesday at 9:30, and we'll pick back up. We'll start Chapter 3. We're going to start Chapter 3. I think we've kind of done Chapter 2 as much as I personally want to do it. There's other parts here, but that's why you read it. That's why you read it. So have a good night, folks. Take care.